On an April morning in 1993, a surfer named John Doyle was sitting on a surfboard out in the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of West Africa, just scanning the water waiting for a wave. John was totally alone out here. There were no other surfers, nothing, and the only sign of human civilization anywhere was John's Land Rover, which was parked up on the sand on the beach. John was an American. He was from Colorado, and so his experience had always been, lots of snow and mountains and trees, because that's Colorado. But now here, off the coast of Africa, it was like a totally different planet. And in fact, today, John was really feeling that because the sun was so hot that day. It was over 95 degrees Fahrenheit, and he could actually feel his back starting to burn as he sat there, waiting for the next wave. And so he told himself, actually, that he would just catch one more wave and then call it a day to avoid a sunburn. But as John continued to kind of scan out across the water waiting for this wave, he noticed about 20 meters away was a shark fin swimming in a circle, like stereotypical terrifying shark behavior. And so John is horrified and he wants to get out of the water immediately, but he's far enough away from shore that if he jumped into the water to swim to shore, he's going to be in the water with the shark thrashing around. He's just going to attract the shark over to him. And so John decides his only hope here to escape the shark is actually just to surf in. That way he'll stay out of the water. It's much faster. He'll get to shore. The shark can't follow him there. It'll be fine. And so, trying to stay calm, John continued to keep his eye on the shark that was still 20 meters away, and he also really looked closely for any swell coming towards him that might be big enough to allow him to surf to shore. And thankfully, after only a couple of minutes, John did see a swell coming towards him that seemed like it would be perfect for a final wave. And so at this point, John is facing out to sea, towards the swell, towards the shark that's still 20 meters away, and he turns himself around, so he's facing towards shore, and then he lays down on his stomach and he begins to paddle towards shore. And as he's doing this, he's checking the swell to see when it's going to come up, when he can stand up, and eventually the swell is right underneath him, and as he's about to stand up on his board and actually surf into shore, he looks into the water that has not quite formed into a wave yet, and he sees the shark. It's literally underneath him. And so John has this sudden surge of adrenaline, and he just jumps up onto his board. He stands up, and for a second, he's stable. He's surfing, and he's riding this wave away from the shark. He's doing exactly what he hoped he could do. He can't believe it. And then, because he was panicked, because he was rushing, because it was a new board, who knows why, the nose of his board suddenly dipped just long enough to throw John off his board and into the water with the shark. And so immediately, as this wave is churning John over, he grabs onto his surfboard and just kind of holds on, and he's waiting for a moment when the wave stops so he can get out of the water, back on his board, and away from the shark. But before the wave even stopped tumbling him over, John suddenly felt the searing pain in his calf. And so John, who's underwater, still clutching his board, he opens his eyes underwater, then he looks down, and through the cloudy water, he can see very clearly it is the shark, and it's a great white shark that is latched on to his leg. And so now, in a total panic, John began punching the nose of the shark, and when he did, the shark actually recoiled and released his leg long enough that John could pull it out. He actually managed to get up onto his board again, and just a second later, almost out of instinct, he was back standing on his board, just surfing along with a leg that was now bleeding profusely into the water. And for a second, John was stable and appeared to be kind of moving towards shore again, but then the shark, it doubled around and swam at John from the side and literally smashed into him, knocking him off the board back into the water. But this time, John managed, when he fell this second time, to actually grab on to the board with both hands. So he has two hands on the board, he's getting tumbled in the water again, but he knows the shark is going to come for him. And so at the last second, he pulled the board close to his body and kind of turned himself like it was a shield. And the shark came flying towards him and bit him. But because he used that surfboard as a shield, the shark just bit the surfboard, ripped off half of it, and swam off with it and began mauling this half of the surfboard. And John, with the other half of the surfboard, he somehow managed to stand up on it. Again, his leg is bleeding everywhere, and he rode this damaged half surfboard into shore successfully away from the shark. And so when John pulled himself up onto the sand, out of the water, he looked back and he saw the shark swimming off. And even though he's in excruciating pain from this attack, he was so relieved. He couldn't believe he actually just survived that. But John did not have time to think about, what good fortune this was in a way, because he was an hour away from the nearest civilization. And between where he was now and that town, there was nothing. There weren't homes, there weren't buildings, there weren't offices, nothing. It was just totally wildlands until you got to that town. And so John knew he would need to get in his car and drive all the way to that town and then get the people of the town to go get medical help. So, he is hours away from getting the help he needs. And so he has no time to waste. And so he crawls through the sand. His leg is killing him, but he's just so focused on getting up to his Land Rover. And he manages to get to his car. He opens the door, he climbs in the driver's seat. And then as soon as he's in there, he shuts and locks the doors. And then he grabs a white t-shirt that he had on the passenger seat and he ripped it into strips. And he used those strips like tourniquets and he wrapped them around his leg, the leg that was bleeding from his calf. And he basically used this tourniquet to attempt to cut off blood flow to his entire right leg to stop the bleeding, to save his life. But the wound on his right leg was so bad and so deep that despite putting on multiple very tight tourniquets, it just wasn't doing very much. He was still losing blood at a pace that likely would kill him before he got to town. And so John was kind of like, well, nothing else I can do but attempt to go to town. So he fired up his car, he reversed off the beach, and began making his way towards town. As John sped along the road, he began to feel very lightheaded. Between the pain in his leg and the extreme heat outside, he just felt very dehydrated and weak. And so he thought to himself, if I can't get a sip of water soon, I'm going to pass out right now and then I'm done for. And so as he's driving along, John began fumbling around his car, looking for any sort of liquid somewhere in the car. But ultimately, all he found was an empty water bottle. And all he saw in every direction was just this barren African savanna with no people and no water anywhere. And so John just kept on driving, hoping eventually he might find some water source. And luckily, after only a couple of minutes, when his eyelids were really starting to droop and he was having a hard time focusing, he noticed up ahead there was a copse of trees with a little creek that ran through it. And so immediately John pulled over and he got out and he hobbled his way over to the water. He laid down on his stomach so his face is basically right over the water. And then he just put his face in the water and began to drink. And as he did, he felt his heart rate start to slow down. He felt himself relax a little bit. And he started to think to himself like, hey, I found water, I'm doing okay. Maybe I will survive this. But right as John was starting to feel optimistic, he felt a new shooting pain on his right side. And so with a little bit of strength he had, he managed to turn his head and looked to see what was going on. And staring back at him was a lion who had just bit his side and was now growling and staring at John and beginning to move its jaw left and right to really sink its teeth into John. Now, this is unbelievably painful for John, and he's already dealing with an unbelievable pain in his leg from the shark attack. And so John's experiencing pain that very few people ever get to experience. And it caused this unbelievable surge of adrenaline, one that you would likely get basically right before you die. That was the level of adrenaline he was getting. And with this adrenaline rush, he grabbed a stick and he began hitting this lion who's locked onto his ribs. And he managed to beat the lion off of him. And the lion, it only backed up maybe a few feet. And it's still totally fixated on John. And it's growling and edging towards him. But John, all he could do was just attempt to get to his Land Rover. And so as soon as the lion had let go of him, he just stood up and kind of pathetically began hobbling as fast as he could towards his Land Rover. And he literally just walked past this lion who's still growling at him, kind of trying to size him up. And he just kept on walking towards his car, and he was almost there when he noticed the sound of the lion growling behind him, which had been constant to this point, had suddenly intensified to the point where John couldn't even help himself. He had to turn around and see what was going on. And when he turned around, he saw now there was not just one lion, but an entire pride of lions. There was at least 4 lions that now had all formed a semicircle and were staring at John and moving towards him to eat him. But John really couldn't do anything about this. All he could do was just hopefully get to his Land Rover in time. And so John just turned back around so his back is to the pride of lions a few feet away from him, and he just continues hobbling towards his car. And as he walked, the lions began swiping at him and cutting his legs open and his arms open. I mean, they're like razor blades just being taken to the backside of him, but they didn't launch a full-bore attack on him. It was like they were just kind of testing him. And then right when the lions were basically about to actually pull John to the ground and eat him, was when John got to the door, opened it up, jumped inside, shut it, and locked it. However, when John went to grab his keys and start the car, he realized he didn't have the keys. And when he turned and looked outside, he saw the pride of lions and his car keys on the ground. He was doomed. He knew there was no way he could get those keys without getting killed in the process. And so John basically just resigned himself to die in his car right here. Like he knew, I'm gonna die in the next few hours. There's nothing I can do. And so he just kind of sat there and waited. And 30 minutes later, John heard a very loud, almost explosion sound coming from somewhere outside of the vehicle. And then he heard it a few more times, and before long, the lions were so startled by it that they ran away. And then he hears what sounds like a series of shutter flashes, like camera flashes. And he's looking around, he can't quite figure out what's even going on, because again, he has all these injuries, he's lost so much blood. And then eventually, John just kind of passes out, having no idea what had just happened. It would turn out there was actually a safari that was happening in the area where John was at the same time, and the safari guide, as they drove past this area, happened to spot John inside of his Land Rover surrounded by lions. And so as all the people in the tour began furiously taking photos of this crazy scene in front of them, the tour guide began firing his rifle into the sky to scare the lions off. And so those were the noises that John was hearing before he passed out. And then after he passed out, the tour guide and all the people on the tour pulled John out of his Land Rover, because now the lions are gone, and they would take him to a hospital where doctors and nurses would have to give him 250 stitches to stitch up all of his various shark and lion wounds. John would make a full recovery, and he would hang up on his wall in his office the broken half of that surfboard that he did successfully manage to ride in to escape the shark. He says the surfboard reminds him how lucky he was. At 8:30 a.m. on Friday, July 18th, 2014, 41-year-old law school professor Dan Markle drove his two young sons to a preschool in an upscale neighborhood in Tallahassee, Florida. It was already a hot summer day, and it was only going to get hotter with temperatures set to go over 90 degrees Fahrenheit by the afternoon. So Dan decided to let the boys in on a surprise he'd been planning. He glanced back at his sons sitting in their car seats and said when he picked them up after school, they could go right to the pool and spend the rest of the day swimming. The boys got so excited, it sounded like Dan had just told them they were going to Disney World. Dan laughed and then drove a little further down the road, turned into the preschool parking lot, and parked his black Honda Accord. Then he stepped outside, helped his boys out of the car, and walked them both up to the door of the school where one of their teachers was waiting. Dan crouched down, gave each of the boys a hug, and told them he loved them and to have a great day. Once the boys were inside, Dan turned around and headed back to the parking lot and got into his car. Dan was average height with short brown hair and a beard, and he wore glasses. And today, he was dressed for the gym in a red t-shirt and black shorts. But before he went for his workout that morning, he knew there was a phone call he needed to make. So he grabbed his cell phone from the pocket of his shorts, pulled up his contact list on the screen, and stared at the name Wendy. Dan let out a long sigh, and his mind started to wander. Wendy Adelson was Dan's ex-wife. They had been divorced for a year and had been separated for almost 2 years, but there were still days when Dan couldn't believe the two of them were not together anymore. Dan and Wendy had met on a dating website 10 years earlier. At the time, Dan had been a law school professor at a university in Washington, D.C., and Wendy was a law student at the University of Miami in South Florida. And soon after they'd exchanged a few messages on the dating site, Wendy had decided she wanted to meet Dan face-to-face, so she hopped on a plane and flew to D.C. And the two of them hit it off in person just as much as they had online. Wendy was totally taken by Dan's incredible intelligence, and she could tell he was driven and that he had a bright career ahead of him. And right after Dan had met Wendy, he told a friend he felt like he'd won the lottery. Wendy was about 7 years younger than Dan, and she was beautiful with long curly brown hair and blue eyes. She had grown up wealthy, but never really talked about money. Instead, she just talked about how important her parents and her older brother Charlie were to her. And Dan loved that, because he thought family was the only thing more important than work or money. And Dan also loved that even though Wendy was studying to become a lawyer just like he was, she was a lot more fun and more of a free spirit than most of his colleagues in the legal profession were. Wendy had dreams of writing a novel, she had been a contestant on the TV game show The Weakest Link, and she'd even considered joining the circus at one point. And Dan felt like Wendy was a breath of fresh air in his relatively routine life. And by the time Wendy had flown back home to Florida a few days later, both of them were already convinced they wanted to spend the rest of their lives together. And so not long after that first meeting, Dan took a teaching position at Florida State University in Tallahassee, and Wendy joined him there when she finished law school. And then, just 8 months after they had first met, Dan and Wendy were engaged. Even now, sitting in his car in the preschool parking lot and staring at Wendy's name on his phone, Dan could still remember how stunning she had looked when she walked down the aisle in her white dress at their wedding, almost like she was glowing. And for a time back then, Dan couldn't believe how lucky he was to have a wife like Wendy and how great his life had turned out. And things had only gotten better when Wendy gave birth to their 2 sons a little over a year apart. And at least for a while, Wendy had seemed really happy too. She'd gotten a teaching job at Florida State, and she, Dan, and their boys would often drive almost 7 hours south to spend time with Wendy's parents and her brother Charlie, so Wendy still felt connected to her own family. But back in the car, Dan felt like his and Wendy's wedding, their first meeting in DC, and his relationship with Wendy's family were all now ancient history. He was never quite sure why their marriage had actually fallen apart, but he was working hard now not to dwell on the past and to try to be happy in the present. Dan took a deep breath and finally called Wendy. He got her voicemail, so he left her a message reminding her he was leaving town soon for an academic conference, so they would need to work out their custody schedule with their boys. Dan and Wendy had joint custody of their kids, but they made accommodations for each other when one of them had to travel for work. Dan hung up and tossed his phone onto the passenger seat. Then he pulled his car out of the parking lot and drove off towards the gym, which was only a few minutes away. And as he looked out his windshield at the trees outside and the sun shining, he reminded himself that he had a fun day planned for him and his sons, and that even if his life was not perfect anymore, it was still pretty great. Dan worked out at the gym for over an hour that morning, and then he walked outside at about 10:45 a.m. He got into his car and drove off, and a few minutes later he arrived in his neighborhood that was lined with large 2-story homes with well-manicured lawns out front. Then, just before Dan pulled onto his street, he remembered he had to make another phone call. His oldest son was about to start taking piano lessons, and Dan had told Wendy that he would set everything up. So he grabbed his phone and he called the piano teacher. And the 2 men were still talking when Dan actually pulled into his driveway. Dan reached up and pushed the garage door opener that was clipped to his sun visor, waited for the door to open, and then pulled his car into the garage. Dan left the car running and the garage door open while he sat in his car and kept talking to the piano teacher. But then suddenly, Dan saw something move in his rearview mirror. He turned to look back and asked the piano teacher to hold on for a second, and then Dan saw someone walking towards his car. Dan turned and looked out the driver's side window to get a better look at this person, but before Dan could say anything, he heard a sound like a firecracker going off. Then Dan's ears started ringing, his vision blurred, and he fell forward against the steering wheel. At 10:50 a.m., about the time Dan had pulled his car into the garage, a married couple in their 70s were sitting on their living room couch in the house next door to Dan's. The couple had just gotten a new iPad, and they were spending a relaxing morning figuring out all of the features it had to offer. Then they heard the loud popping sound coming from the house next door. The man got off the couch and rushed over to the large bay window in the living room. He looked outside and saw a light-colored car peeling out of Dan's driveway. He looked at his wife and he said he wanted to see what was going on and that he was worried someone might have broken into Dan's house and just driven off. His wife told him to please be careful, and the man said he would be, and then he stepped outside. The sun was bright and he shielded his eyes to block the glare as he walked across his lawn towards Dan's driveway. And as he got closer, he heard the sound of a car running. And then when he looked into the garage, he saw Dan's black Honda Accord parked there. So this man figured he must have just misunderstood what had just happened. If Dan was parked in the garage, someone would not have been robbing his house, and the light-colored car might have just backfired and made the sound he had just heard. So the neighbor turned around, walked back to his house and into his living room, but instead of rejoining his wife on the couch, he went back to the window and stared out at Dan's driveway. He just wanted to wait and see Dan pull out of the garage or close the garage door, and that way he would be sure everything really was okay. But after a few minutes, the garage door was still open and Dan's car was still inside. The man leaned up against his window, squinted, and tried to see if there was any movement next door inside the house, but nothing was happening, and he started to get an uneasy feeling in his stomach. So he told his wife he was going to go back outside again to actually go check on Dan. This time, the neighbor moved quickly across his yard to Dan's driveway, and he could hear the car still running. He called out to Dan as he turned the corner, but nobody replied. Then he stepped into the garage, and immediately he stopped in his tracks. He felt broken glass crunch under his feet, and he knew something had to be wrong. The man rushed to Dan's driver's side window, and he gasped. Almost all of the glass in the window had shattered, and in the car, he saw Dan's body slumped over the wheel. The neighbor shouted Dan's name several times, but Dan didn't respond. So the man leaned in closer to the shattered window, and he saw blood in Dan's hair and on his face, but he could see that Dan was still breathing. So the man turned around and ran back to his house as fast as he could. He threw the front door open, grabbed his phone in the living room, and he dialed 911. When the operator picked up, the man told him that they needed urgent help at the house next door. He said his neighbor was bleeding from his head, but he was still breathing. But for some reason, the operator asked the neighbor a bunch of questions about what specifically he had seen that had prompted him to call 911. The neighbor didn't understand what was happening. He just kept saying that his neighbor was slumped over in his car, there was blood in his hair and on his face, and they needed to help him right now. Finally, the operator said yes, they would send someone over. At that point, the neighbor hung up, ran back outside, and rushed over to Dan's garage again. He leaned into the shattered window and tried to talk to Dan. Dan didn't respond, but the neighbor could see Dan was still alive and breathing. The neighbor's hands were shaking, and he kept looking out at the street. He didn't understand why it was taking so long for an ambulance to arrive. Then finally, over 15 minutes after he'd called 911, the neighbor heard a siren approaching. But when he walked out of the garage and looked down the street, he saw a police car, not an ambulance. The police car parked in front of the house, and as soon as the officer stepped out, the neighbor ran towards him and waved him to come into the garage. And when the police officer saw Dan slumped over in the car struggling to breathe, he didn't understand why he had been the one dispatched to the scene instead of an ambulance. So he called the station and said they needed an ambulance immediately, and then after that, the officer reached into Dan's car and shut off the engine. Then, finally, a few minutes later, an ambulance did arrive, and Dan was rushed off to the hospital. But as Dan's neighbor listened to the ambulance siren fade into the distance, he worried that the few minutes he'd waited before calling 911, and then all the confusion that had occurred with the emergency operator had cost Dan so much time, and quite possibly his life. At around noon that day, less than an hour after the ambulance arrived at Dan's house, Detective Craig Issam of the Tallahassee Police drove through a wealthy neighborhood, and he saw kids who were off from school for the summer laughing and playing in their front yards. But as Issam turned onto Dan Street, the flashing lights from squad cars and the yellow crime scene tape around Dan's house painted a very different picture. He parked his car in the line of cop cars on the street, looked out the window, and saw several officers moving in and out of Dan's open garage. Issam knew some people thought bad things never happened in upscale neighborhoods like this one, but he'd been a cop for 25 years, and so he knew bad things could happen anywhere. Issam stepped out of the car and walked up Dan's driveway. He was a stocky man with short-cropped gray hair, and today he wore a black golf shirt tucked into khaki pants. Detective Issam took off his sunglasses and stepped into the garage, where the first officers who'd arrived at the scene were looking at Dan's parked car. There was glass all over the ground, and Issam saw the driver's side window was almost completely shattered. And when he looked in the car, he saw a broken pair of eyeglasses on the floorboard. All Issam knew about the scene was that Dan Markle, a well-respected law school professor, had been found slumped over in this car with bullet wounds in his head, and that he had been taken to the hospital. Issam talked briefly with the other officers on the scene, and he learned that when they had checked the house, there was no signs of struggle or forced entry. He also learned that the next-door neighbor was the one who had found Dan and called 911. So, while the officers continued to photograph the scene inside of the garage and dust Dan's car for fingerprints, Issam walked next door and found Dan's neighbor still standing outside. Issam smiled and told the man he'd just like to ask him some questions, and the man said he wanted to help in any way he could. Then, the man relayed his version of events from the time he'd heard the popping sound next door and gone to look out the window. And as Issam listened, one thing jumped out at him: the car the man had seen peeling out of the driveway. But this neighbor had not gotten a license plate number, and he could only say it looked like a pretty common car that was a light color. With that description, Issam knew finding the specific car might end up being impossible, but at least it was something to go on. Issam also learned from the neighbor that Dan had 2 young sons and an ex-wife named Wendy Adelson. Issam had no idea whether Wendy was connected to the car that had driven off from Dan's house, but in cases like this, the ex-spouse was almost always the first person to talk to. So Issam thanked the man for his help and then walked back to Dan's garage. By this point, police had gotten word from the hospital that Dan was not going to survive, and they would later learn that Dan had never regained consciousness at the hospital and he had died at around 1 p.m. Issam also found out that for some reason, the 911 operator had not made the call from Dan's neighbor a high-priority response. Issam didn't know if a faster emergency response would have saved Dan's life, but when he heard the news that Dan wasn't going to make it, his first thoughts were of Dan's sons. Dwelling on the 911 call wouldn't change the fact that 2 young boys would now have to grow up without their father, and that hit Issam very hard. And that news also made it very important for him to talk to Dan's ex-wife as soon as possible. Regardless of her potential involvement in what happened to Dan, she would still have to tell her sons that their father was now dead. So Issam walked back to his car, left the scene of the crime, and started looking for Wendy. At around 2:30 p.m., about 3.5 hours after the 911 call, Detective Issam pulled into the parking lot of a high-end shopping center. With the help of cell phone and GPS data, police had tracked Wendy down to a popular restaurant that was there. Issam got out of his car, walked into the restaurant, and scanned the tables. He spotted Wendy sitting with 2 other women. She was 35 years old, and she wore a dark blue t-shirt with a print on it and blue shorts. And she had her hair pulled up in a bun with her sunglasses perched on top. Issam stood there and watched Wendy for a few moments. She was talking with her friends and laughing, and so on the surface, she did not appear to have any idea about what had just happened to her ex-husband, but Issam knew that didn't necessarily mean she was totally innocent. Some people were just really good at hiding things. So Issam made his way over to their table, and right away the 3 women stopped what they were doing and looked up at him. He smiled and said he was sorry to interrupt their lunch, but that he needed to speak to Wendy Adelson. Wendy immediately put her hand up and had a very confused look on her face. Then Issam showed her his badge and told her he needed to talk to her at the station about an incident that had occurred that morning. And the look of confusion on Wendy's face turned to fear, and she wanted to know if her children were all right. Issam assured her her children were fine, and then he asked her to come to the station again. Wendy looked at her friends nervously, and then she grabbed her purse and followed Detective Issam out of the restaurant. Once they were outside, Wendy climbed into Issam's car, and the 2 of them rode the 10 minutes to the police station in almost complete silence. When they arrived at the police station, another officer led Wendy into a small interrogation room where she took a seat at a wooden table. Even after being outside in the Florida sun, the light in the room seemed bright and glaring to Wendy. A few minutes later, Issam walked in, carrying a small notebook and a pen. He closed the door behind him and took a seat across from Wendy at the table. Right away, Wendy wanted to know what was going on and why she'd been brought here. So Issam told her that earlier that morning, her ex-husband, Dan, had been shot and killed in his car while he was parked in the garage. Wendy immediately burst into tears and buried her face in her hands and kept saying, "Oh my God, oh my God." Then, at some point, Wendy looked up at Issam, and something in her eyes changed, like the lawyer in her had suddenly kicked in. She told the detective she understood why she was here. She was a suspect. but she said she had nothing to do with whatever happened to Dan. Issam told her he was just trying to get a better understanding of what might have happened, and Wendy nodded and then took a deep breath. Then Issam asked her where she had been that day before she went to the restaurant where he'd found her with her friends. She said she'd been at home in the morning, had gone to the liquor store to buy a gift for a housewarming party, and then she went right to the restaurant. Issam scribbled notes in his notebook, looked up at Wendy again, and asked her if there was anyone she could think of who would have wanted to hurt Dan. But Wendy shook her head. She said Dan could be a tough professor and difficult to get along with at work because he was a perfectionist, but she couldn't imagine any of his students or colleagues doing something like this. So Issam asked Wendy about their divorce, and she told him it had gotten pretty ugly at first, and that Dan had not been the easiest person to be married to. But then she told him that she and Dan had been really working hard to get along better for the sake of their sons. Then suddenly a look of panic came across Wendy's face. She remembered Dan was supposed to pick up the kids at school, and now they'd be left there alone. And when she mentioned her sons, she started crying again. Issam tried to comfort her and told her they would make sure the kids were okay, and he asked her if there were friends the police could call to make sure someone was at the school when the boys got out. Wendy took another deep breath, then grabbed her phone out of her pocket and scrolled through her contacts to get Issam a list of names and phone numbers. Issam said making sure the boys were taken care of was his top priority, so he got up from the table, crossed the room, and stepped out into the hall. And once he was out there, he asked an officer to call the list of Wendy's friends she had just given him to see if one of them could pick the boys up. And then Issam just waited and left Wendy alone in the interrogation room. During his time as a lead investigator, Issam had conducted his fair share of interrogations, and there were plenty of times he could pretty much immediately get a read on someone he was interrogating. Other times, though, people were just too hard to understand, and right now he wasn't quite sure about Wendy. He believed she was grieving, and he believed her story about where she had been that morning, but he felt like she just wasn't telling him everything. He thought that could just be the lawyer in her, or maybe she was in shock, or maybe she really was hiding something. About 40 minutes went by, and Issam got word that officers had contacted one of Wendy's friends who said she'd picked the boys up at preschool. Issam thanked the officer and then headed back into the interrogation room, determined to get as much information from Wendy as possible. So, again, he took a seat across from Wendy and then told her which friend was going to get the boys, at which point Wendy breathed a huge sigh of relief and thanked him. Then Issam looked her in the eye and asked her if there was someone in hers or Dan's life that maybe she hadn't thought about who could possibly want to harm Dan. At first, Wendy kind of laughed and joked that during the divorce, some of her family probably wanted to punch Dan on more than one occasion, but that was just because they loved her. But then Wendy stopped laughing and she got a serious look on her face. She covered her mouth with her hand and her eyes went wide. Then she looked across the table at Issam, lowered her hand, and said something had just hit her. There was somebody she hadn't thought about who hated Dan. Her most recent ex-boyfriend, Jeff Lacasse. Issam wrote Jeff's name down in his notebook, then he asked why Wendy thought Jeff might have a problem with Dan. And she said that she and Jeff had only been dating for a few months when Jeff started getting really jealous of any other man that she talked to. And she said Jeff couldn't stand Dan for that reason, and that Jeff had a bit of a temper. Then Issam asked what kind of car Jeff drove, and Wendy said a silver Nissan Sentra. Issam jotted that down in his notebook. A silver Nissan Sentra could fit the description of the car that Dan's neighbor had seen speeding away from the house. Issam thanked Wendy for all her help, and after 5 hours, her interview was finally over. Issam was a long way from ruling Wendy out as a suspect, but for right now, he really wanted to go talk to her ex-boyfriend, Jeff. After Detective Issam met with Wendy, police contacted her ex-boyfriend, Jeff, who was also a professor at Florida State. Jeff agreed to meet with police, and they arranged for him to come to the station on the afternoon of Monday, July 21st, which would be 3 days after Dan's murder. But on the morning of July 20th, so a day before Issam and his team would meet with Jeff, they walked into a local synagogue and stood at the back for Dan's memorial service. At the service, Issam was struck by the number of Dan's former students who spoke about how much Dan had helped them in school, and how his willingness to push them to always do better had helped them achieve more than they thought possible. But it was the end of the memorial service that would stick in Issam's mind for years to come. Dan's mom stood at the front of the synagogue and spoke about how much she loved her son, and how much he had meant to so many people, not only at Florida State, but to the Jewish community throughout Tallahassee. And then, through tears, she invited Wendy and the boys to come join her. Wendy, along with her boys, made her way to the front of the synagogue and listened to her former mother-in-law talk about how much Dan's children had meant to him. And while this happened, Detective Issam listened to people seated throughout the synagogue start to cry. Then he saw Wendy's mom stand up, cross in front of Wendy's dad and brother Charlie, and make her way to the very front as well. And there she promised Dan's mom, as one grandmother to another, that Dan's family would always have a place in Dan's sons' lives. Issam left the memorial service, and he was taken by how many people that single act of violence in Dan's garage had affected. And as he drove away, he was determined to find out who had pulled the trigger, and he hoped Wendy's ex-boyfriend would help him get closer to the truth. The next day, on the afternoon of July 21st, Jeff Lacasse sat behind a wooden table in an interrogation room just like the one Wendy had been in. Jeff was 42 years old, and he was thin, with brown hair and a beard. He wore a t-shirt and jeans, and he wore glasses. When Jeff had first arrived at the station, Detective Issam had been surprised by how much he looked just like Dan. Issam stayed outside of the room and watched on a camera feed as another investigator stepped into the interrogation room first and took a seat at the table across from Jeff. Even before the investigator started talking, Jeff started fidgeting in his chair and tapping his fingers on the table like he couldn't sit still. Then, the investigator asked Jeff if there was anything he could tell them about Dan and Wendy. Jeff smiled and said he could tell them a lot. Looking at the screen, Issam got the sense that he wasn't really watching an interview. He was watching a guy get everything off his chest he'd ever wanted to say about his ex-girlfriend. Without prompting, Jeff gave a very long monologue about his and Wendy's relationship and how he still loved her, even though he knew she didn't love him. He barely stopped to take a breath, and he used his hands to accentuate certain points in the story. Jeff admitted that he did not like Dan because, as Wendy's ex-husband, Dan was always going to be in their lives, and he complained that at Florida State, Dan was one of those professors who thought he was smarter than everyone else, and that totally rubbed Jeff the wrong way. But despite all that, Jeff said he would never do anything to Dan. The idea of shooting someone was completely foreign to him, and he said he had been in Tennessee on the day of the murder, and he could give police the names of a bunch of people who would vouch for him. But even after Jeff had offered a potential alibi, he kept talking, and as Issam continued to watch from outside the room, he couldn't believe how much Jeff was willing to say without even being asked. And at times, Issam couldn't tell if he was watching a man put on an act, or if he was watching someone who just really had nothing to hide. But then, during a rant about how sometimes he felt like Wendy wasn't being completely honest with him, Jeff said something that stunned Issam and the investigator who was actually in the room. The investigator put up his hands and asked Jeff to stop talking for a second, and then asked Jeff to repeat what he had just said. Jeff laughed a little, caught his breath, and repeated himself. And when Issam heard what Jeff had to say again, he felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. And what Jeff had said would make Issam look at the case in a completely different way than he had in the first few days of the investigation. And Issam's new approach to the case would eventually help police find that mysterious car that had peeled out of Dan's driveway, and that would lead them to who had killed Dan. Some elements of Dan Markel's murder are still under investigation and pending trial. But, based on interviews, evidence at the crime scene, and surveillance camera footage, this is a reconstruction of the police's leading theory about what happened to Dan on July 18, 2014. A little before 8:30 a.m. on July 18th, the killers sat in a light green Toyota Prius vehicle on the street a few houses down from Dan's house. They were calm, and each one knew their role. The driver would make sure they never lost sight of Dan, and the shooter, who was sitting in the passenger seat with a Smith & Wesson revolver in their hand, would pull the trigger when the time came. Then the killers watched as Dan's garage door opened, and they watched him pull out onto the street with his two sons in the backseat of the car. The driver waited a few seconds and then followed Dan. The driver wound his way through the neighborhood, keeping Dan in their sights without getting too close to his car, like a hunter stalking their prey. And when Dan pulled into a preschool parking lot, the driver found a spot on the street to park and wait. Finally, after Dan had walked the kids up to the school, gone back to his car, and made a phone call, the killers watched him drive back onto the road, and they followed him. They still didn't feel like they were in a hurry, and they never panicked. They knew what their goal was, and they would wait until the perfect moment arrived. So when Dan drove to the gym and went inside to work out, the driver just found a parking spot outside a few spaces away from Dan's car, and the killers waited again. While Dan was in the gym, the killers, sitting in the car, just talked and joked as if nothing out of the ordinary was happening. And then, after they'd been sitting there for over half an hour, the driver backed out of the parking spot, drove around the lot, and found a new spot. The driver didn't want anyone who had seen the car while walking into the gym to see the car still there when they walked out. Then, after over an hour had passed since Dan had gone into the gym, the driver spotted Dan again, walking out of the gym and back to his car. And at this point, the killers felt like they were getting close. Their sense of anticipation was starting to grow. The killers followed as Dan drove out of the gym parking lot and back into his neighborhood. And as they approached Dan's street, the killers saw Dan make another phone call. Then, at about 10:50 a.m., almost 2.5 hours after the killers had first started tailing him, Dan had arrived home and pulled his car into the garage. At this point, the killers pulled into the driveway and parked the Prius. Then the shooter opened the passenger door, stepped outside, and crossed in front of the Prius. They saw Dan glancing back at them from his own car, so they rushed into the garage before Dan could have a chance to close the door. Then the shooter walked within 2 feet of the driver's side window and saw Dan turning towards them, still holding his phone. So the killer took a breath, raised the gun, and fired. Glass from the window shattered, and the killer threw their arm up to protect their face. The .38 caliber bullet had struck Dan in the cheek and lodged in his ear canal. Dan's ears were ringing and blood ran down his face, but he could still move. So Dan raised his left arm in a desperate attempt to protect himself. But the shooter didn't waste any time. They fired again, and this time the bullet broke Dan's glasses and lodged deep in his skull. At this point, Dan slumped forward. The shooter ran out of the garage, back to the Prius, threw the passenger door open, jumped into the car, and shouted for the driver to go, go, go. The driver gunned the engine, peeled out of the driveway, and sped off down the street. Minutes later, the killers drove out of the neighborhood and onto a highway heading south towards Miami. And when they were far enough from the crime scene, the driver made a phone call to a woman in South Florida and told her everything had gone according to plan. And then that woman hung up her phone and told her boyfriend, Charlie Adelson, that the job was done. It would take Detective Issam, the Tallahassee police, and members of the Federal Bureau of Investigation years to put all the puzzle pieces together, but they would come to believe that Wendy Adelson's brother, Charlie, had paid 2 hitmen roughly $100,000 to murder his sister's ex-husband. It would turn out that Wendy had no desire to share custody of the boys with Dan, and that she had even filed a motion with the court that would allow her to move with the boys 7 hours away to South Florida so she could be closer to her own family. But Dan had fought the motion, and the judge had ruled in his favor, and so Wendy was stuck in Tallahassee. As of now, police have never officially tied Wendy to Dan's murder, but her ex-boyfriend Jeff was key in turning their suspicions towards Wendy's brother Charlie. During his long-winded speech in the interrogation room, Jeff had said he didn't think Wendy would kill Dan, but he was almost sure Charlie would be up for it. That is what had stunned the investigator in the room with Jeff, as well as Issam, who was watching the interrogation via the camera outside. And it would turn out that when Jeff had gone to South Florida on a trip with Wendy to meet her family, Charlie had spent most of the time talking about how much he hated Dan, to the point that Jeff thought it was kind of bizarre and obsessive, and how Charlie also thought that Wendy should be allowed to live anywhere she wanted with her sons. And what had seemed even more bizarre was that Charlie had once made a joke to Wendy that he could just hire a hitman to kill Dan if he wanted to, and Charlie had implied he had enough money to basically do whatever he wanted and get away with it. And so Detective Issam started to think Dan's death might have been a murder for hire, and that Charlie had possibly arranged the murder from South Florida. So, with help from state law enforcement agencies, Issam had expanded the police search of surveillance footage to include cars that could possibly match the description Dan's neighbor had given and that had been driven up from South Florida into Tallahassee on the day of the murder. And surveillance footage from bus cameras, toll roads, and businesses led police to the light green Prius, which they were able to track from Miami all the way to the parking lot of Dan's gym as the Prius drove off and followed Dan home. The Prius turned out to be a rental car, and police traced it back to 2 men in Miami with criminal records. And one of those men would confess to the murder and make it known that he and his partner had a close connection to a woman who happened to be dating Wendy's brother, Charlie. The driver of the Prius was sentenced to 12.5 years in prison. The man who pulled the trigger and killed Dan was sentenced to life in prison plus 30 years. The woman who was dating Charlie and who was believed to have directly recruited the killers was sentenced to life in prison as well, and Wendy's brother, Charlie Adelson, is awaiting a trial that is set to begin in October of 2023. And again, Wendy has never been officially linked to the murder of her ex-husband. And despite the promises that had been made at Dan's memorial service, Wendy and her family kept Dan's parents from seeing their grandchildren for years. But Dan's parents fought in court just like they thought their son would have, and in June of 2022, the Markle Act was signed into law, and it now protects grandparents and grandchildren from being kept apart when certain tragic events take place.
Every moment we together, from the dawn to twilight's glow, I'll love all I ever know.
In 1978, 49-year-old Georgy Markov, who was originally from Bulgaria, was living in London and working as a reporter for the British Broadcasting Company, or BBC for short. Georgy had moved to London 6 years earlier, and in the early days of him being in the UK, he would always take a cab or a bus to work. But over the last couple of years, he had taken to walking to work. Not only was it great exercise, but he also just loved the scenery. In particular, he liked on his commute to stop on the Waterloo Bridge, this very famous bridge in London, where from that position he had a beautiful view of the Westminster Palace on one side, and he had the iconic London Eye on the other, which is a very famous Ferris wheel. So on the morning of September 7th of that year, Georgy got up and he left his flat, and he began his typical commute into work. However, by the time he reached the Waterloo Bridge and was getting ready to take in the sights, it had started to rain, and Georgy did not have an umbrella. And so instead of sightseeing, he just kept on walking as quickly as he could to try to get to his office before he got completely soaked. But by the time he was just on the other side of the Waterloo Bridge and still had quite a distance to cover to get to work, the skies had completely opened up. And so as much as Georgy wanted to walk, because this was something he really enjoyed, he decided it was not worth it. And so he began looking for a bus stop, and he found one pretty quickly, and he rushed over to it. There was an awning that the commuters could stand underneath, and so he ran underneath this awning, getting out from under the rain, and then he proceeded to wait for the next bus to take him the rest of the way. As he stood there waiting, he suddenly felt a shooting pain in the back of his right thigh. And instinctively, without even knowing what it was, he just reached down and grabbed his leg, but he couldn't feel anything. And then he tried to kind of look around and look down at his leg, but it was just too crowded around him, so he really couldn't do it. And so he's standing there puzzled, still grabbing at his leg, wondering what could have caused this pain. And the only things he could think of were, maybe someone near him had a pen or a pencil out and they accidentally poked him, or maybe it's some sort of bug that bit him, a spider or a bee or something. He didn't know, but there weren't that many scenarios that made sense to him. But before he could spend very much time dwelling on what had caused this, the bus arrived and Georgy turned around, he hopped on board, and by the time the bus pulled up in front of his office building and he had gone through the doors of the BBC, Georgy had effectively forgotten about this pain in his leg. But when he got up to his actual desk and sat down on his chair, when the underside of his thigh made contact with his chair, it sent that shooting pain into his leg, and immediately he noticed it. It was almost like he had a splinter stuck in the back of his thigh, and by pressing it down on the seat, it was driving that splinter deeper into his leg. And so Georgy stood up immediately, and he's grabbing at the back of his leg, and he's kind of craning his head to look down at the back of his leg, but, he doesn't see anything there. And so he's standing there wondering what he should do. He's got a really busy day ahead of him, and he's thinking, should I maybe go to the bathroom and see what this is? But then he tells himself, you're overthinking it. This has got to be something minor. I need to get to work. And so he sat back down in his chair, being very careful with his right leg when he placed it down so as not to press too hard on the spot that hurt. and then he just got to work. And over the course of several hours, even though he knew there was kind of a dull, aching pain in the back of his leg, he mostly forgot about it. He was just doing his job. But by the second half of the day, in the early afternoon, the pain in his leg had become so excruciating that Georgie was literally gritting his teeth and sweating profusely in order to try to ignore the pain. But at some point, it just became too much. He couldn't focus on work, and so he stood up, he left his desk, and he walked down the hall, and he went into the single-stall bathroom. And once he went inside and he shut the door behind him, he pulled his pants down and turned around and looked in the mirror to use the reflection to look at the back of his leg. And right away, there was a little bit of a relief there, because what he saw was a little bit of redness, a little bit of swelling, but nothing significant. It looked very much like someone must have hit him with a pencil by accident, or maybe it was a bee sting or a spider bite or something, but whatever it was definitely minor, at least in Georgie's mind. And so he pulls his pants back up, he tucks his shirt back in, he leaves the bathroom and goes back to his desk. And then he sits down, and despite this intense pain in his leg, he's convinced himself it's no big deal, and so he just kind of grits his way through the rest of his workday. When he finally got home again and walked through the door, Georgie's wife looked at him and was like, "What's wrong with you?" He was so pale, he was sweating profusely, he looked awful. And so he told her about what had happened with his leg, and he was still trying to kind of write it off. But she told him, "Georgie, you are sick, there's something wrong, we have to go to the hospital right now." And so at this point, Georgie was miserable, and so he agreed to go. And so the pair, they made their way over to the emergency room at the hospital. They go inside, and a doctor pulled Georgie into an exam room and said, "Okay, tell me what's going on. Why are you here?" And Georgie would explain how in his morning commute, he had stopped at this bus stop and then felt this shooting pain. And then he told the doctor, "I'm pretty convinced this is someone who might have accidentally jabbed me with a pen or a pencil, or it's a bug bite, a spider bite. I don't know what it is, but I'm convinced it's something minor." And so the doctor, he hears this, and he asks Georgie to stand up, pull his pants down so the doctor can get a look at the site. And so Georgie does. He gets up, he drops his pants, and then as the doctor bends down and begins looking at the back of his thigh, Georgie kind of turns around and looks down, and he's shocked at what he sees. Even though he does not have a full view of the back of his leg, it's obvious that the swelling and redness on the back of his leg has grown exponentially. It looks totally horrible. And so after a couple of minutes of the doctor looking at the back of his leg, the doctor stands up and looks puzzled and tells Georgie, "Hold on a minute, I need somebody else to get a look at this." And so the doctor goes out into the main hall, he comes back with another doctor, and that doctor comes over, he bends down, and he looks at the back of Georgie's leg as well. And after the two of them kind of talk to each other and they're looking at the back of his leg, they stand up and they walk around and they're facing Georgie now, and they say, "Okay, this is going to sound totally weird, but when you were at the bus stop, before you felt the pain in your leg, was anyone around you holding a snake or a reptile? I know that sounds crazy, but the mark on the back of your leg looks exactly like a venomous bite." So Georgie's like, "No, I didn't see anyone with snakes or reptiles. There was nothing out of the ordinary about what was happening around me when I felt this pain in my leg. We were all just standing there, and then I felt it in my leg. That was it." And so the doctors would tell Georgie that, they didn't really know what was going on with his leg. And so the best thing to do here is just to admit him to the hospital and monitor him and, try to run some tests on him and try to make him comfortable. And so that night, Georgie was admitted to the hospital. He was set up in his own hospital room. And right away, the nurses and doctors began administering different combinations of medicines and treatments to try to lower the swelling and the pain in his leg. But it just seemed like nothing was working. And so all night, his condition seemed to get worse, not better. And then the next day, when he woke up, his leg was much, much worse. It was extremely swollen. It almost looked like a balloon that had been completely filled. It was very red. And Georgie himself was also beginning to lose touch with reality. He had become convinced that someone had tried to kill him, and that was why he was so sick. And this delusion of his got so extreme that he was afraid of his doctors and nurses. And so it became a big challenge trying to help him because he was effectively fighting them off. By the next day, Georgie's condition overall had become critical. He was very clearly on the brink of death, and his mind was effectively gone. But the doctors and the nurses really had no idea what was going on with him, and so there was nothing they could do to help him. And then on the last day he was in the hospital, the third day, Georgie would die. His body just shut down. Given the strangeness of Georgie's death, his body was sent for an autopsy to try to figure out what had caused that leg pain, because that seemed to be the trigger that ultimately killed him. And sure enough, during the autopsy, the coroner made a surprising discovery. Buried in the back of his right leg, right underneath the site that was where he felt the pain, was this little piece of metal. It was so small, the coroner actually almost didn't see it. But when he did see it, he put it under the microscope, and what he saw was this obviously man-made metallic disc that had these two small reservoirs drilled into it. And so they sent this disc off for further testing, and what they discovered was there was ricin residue inside of those two reservoirs. Ricin is an extremely powerful poison. It is more lethal than cyanide, and it has no antidote. And the symptoms of ricin poisoning often look like the symptoms of other diseases or illnesses, and so it's very difficult to diagnose. And so as a result of these factors, ricin is a very popular poison for assassinations. And the belief is that that is exactly what happened to Georgie. He was assassinated. But to this day, we don't actually know who assassinated him. However, the running theory is that Georgie, who was a reporter for the BBC, he covered politics, and he often spoke very critically about the Soviet Union. And so this theory goes that the Soviet Union's intelligence agency, known as the KGB, they assassinated Georgie for what he was writing about. Adding credence to this theory, a former KGB officer named Oleg Kaligan, who was exiled to the United States in 1991, he claimed that he oversaw the assassination program that targeted Georgy Markov. He said what they did is they put this little tiny disc, that metal disc with the ricin inside of it, they put that at the tip of an umbrella, and they made sure the disc itself was fairly sharp. And then the KGB assassin with this umbrella simply followed Georgie on his typical morning commute, and then when he stopped at that bus stop, the assassin jabbed him in the back of the leg and then faded into the crowd. According to Oleg, those little metallic discs that had the ricin inside of them, they were actually covered with a thin layer of wax, and only when this disc had been placed inside of the target's body would their body heat melt that wax layer off, exposing the poison, and then their target would die several days later, as Georgie did. However, Oleg's story, despite being as compelling as it was, didn't have any hard proof to back it up. And so to this day, there has been no one officially charged with Georgy Markov's murder. Our next story is called Professional Job. In 2000, Mary Lou Morris was a 48-year-old loan officer at a Chase Bank in Houston, Texas. On the morning of October 12th, Mary Lou said goodbye to her husband, Jay, and she headed off to work. That afternoon, Jay gave his wife a phone call, but she didn't pick up. He left her a message, and she never got back to him. This was very unlike Mary Lou, and so Jay was a little bit concerned. At 5 p.m., when he still hadn't heard from her, Jay called her back, but again, she didn't pick up. So Jay called Mary Lou's supervisor, who informed Jay that Mary Lou had actually not come to work that day, and they couldn't get in touch with her either. Jay immediately knew something was wrong, and he called the police. The police had not even begun searching for her when a call came into the station from an ATV rider that happened to be on a road about 3 miles away from Mary Lou's house. And he said he spotted a smoldering car, and it looks like there's someone in the driver's seat that's obviously deceased. Earlier that day at about 10 a.m., the fire department had gotten a call about smoke in that area, but they assumed it was a controlled burn, so they didn't investigate. When the police arrived on scene, it was impossible to tell who the person was that was sitting in the driver's seat, but they were able to find a tooth fragment, and they used that to confirm that it was in fact Mary Lou Morris. It was quickly determined that this was most likely a homicide, and her attacker had probably set this up to make it appear like it could have been self-inflicted. gasoline had been poured all over Mary Lou and all over the vehicle. However, because of how badly damaged the car and she was, they couldn't determine a cause of death, so they weren't sure if she was deceased when she was placed in the car and it was lit on fire, or if she was in the car and the fire was the cause of death. A number of Mary Lou's valuables were still inside of the car, but her wedding ring was not on her finger. Mary Lou's family and the community at large were shocked. They just could not understand why anybody would want to target such a nice person that had no enemies. The day after Mary Lou's death, a local Houston newspaper received an anonymous call from a guy who just said Mary Lou's death was an accident. And the newspaper tried to get more information, but the person hung up and they couldn't trace the call. At the same time this drama was unfolding for Mary Lou Morris, another drama was unfolding for another Houston woman with the same name. 39-year-old Mary McGinnis Morris was a successful nurse practitioner who by and large got along with all of her coworkers with one exception. A new employee at the clinic, a male nurse named Dwayne Young, was making her feel really uncomfortable. One day when Mary McGinnis got back to her desk, she found all of her pictures of her family had been flipped onto their faces, and in the middle of her desk was a piece of paper that just said death to her. And she knew right away this had to be Dwayne, but she had no way to prove it. And so that night when she went home, she told her husband, Mike, about this guy, Dwayne, and she said, I don't feel safe at work. Can you teach me how to shoot a gun? And so he did. He taught her how to shoot a gun, and then he went out and got a pistol, and she tucked it under her driver's seat in her car just in case. On October 16th, so 4 days after Mary Lou Morris was found dead, and 3 days after that anonymous phone call to the newspaper, Mary McGinnis Morris was at a drugstore after work. And as soon as she went inside, she noticed there was this strange man on the other side of the store that was just watching her. She called her best friend Lori to tell her that there was this strange guy and wanted to know what to do. And Lori said, wait for him to leave. But the guy didn't leave. He just stayed in the store and stared at Mary. And so eventually Mary said, you know what? I'm just going to pay for my stuff and get out of here. I got to stop by the office, but I'll be home in just a few minutes. I'll be totally fine. And so Mary hangs up. She buys what she needs. She leaves the store. And then 12 minutes later, she places a frantic 911 call saying someone's trying to kill her. And this 911 call was not made public because apparently on the tape, you can actually hear her being attacked. Mary McGinnis was found later that night in her car. She was deceased. She had a single gunshot wound to the head. It was clear from her 911 call that she had been attacked, and so this was almost certainly a homicide. However, her attacker tried to stage it so it looked like it was self-inflicted. The murder weapon, which was actually her pistol that was tucked underneath her seat, had been placed next to her hand on the seat next to her. None of Mary McGinnis's valuables were stolen. However, her wedding ring was missing from her finger. After Mary McGinnis Morris's death, people began to speculate that her death and Mary Lou Morris's death were connected. Specifically, this was a professional hit gone wrong. The reasoning for this theory is there was just too many coincidences. They shared the same name, they lived in the same city, they were killed within days of each other, and both of their deaths were staged to look like they were self-inflicted. And each woman was missing their wedding ring, which apparently is a common way for professional hitmen to let their clients know that the job was done. The people that subscribe to this theory believe Mary McGinnis Morris was the intended target and Mary Lou Morris was just an accident. And in fact, after killing Mary Lou Morris, the hitman must have realized, whoops, I made a mistake, and they called the newspaper to say, literally, that was a mistake. And then a couple of days later, the hit was successfully carried out on Mary McGinnis Morris. The police looked into this theory and they discovered that Mary McGinnis's husband, Mike, had recently accused her of cheating on him, and he was really, really upset about it. He also refused to take a polygraph test and would not allow his daughter to talk to the police. And Mary McGinnis had a $700,000 life insurance policy that Mike was in line to receive. And so immediately everybody's like, okay, obviously Mike put a hit out on his wife, and that's what started this whole thing. But when they dug into it, they realized that no matter how upset Mike was, there wasn't any evidence that tied him to the killing of his wife or to Mary Lou Morris, and so he was ruled out as a suspect. As for Mary McGinnis's co-worker, Dwayne Young, who wrote "death to her" on her desk, it was clear that he did not like Mary, but he was ruled out as a suspect as well. And unfortunately, that's where both of these cases go cold. To date, no one's ever been charged in either murder. The next and final story of today's episode is called Dispatch. Early on the afternoon of October 12, 1960, a 17-year-old high school student named Otoya Yamaguchi stood alone in his brother's house in the city of Tokyo, Japan, waiting for a tea kettle of water to boil. It was a Wednesday, so Otoya should have been at school, but that day he had gone to school and then snuck out a side door during lunch. More and more often these days, Otoya was feeling like school was kind of meaningless. It was hard for him to sit in history class and watch all of his classmates diligently take notes when, in Otoya's mind, he felt like all the real history was happening outside of the classroom. Just then, the kettle on the stove began to whistle, which meant the water was boiling, and so Otoya grabbed the kettle, he took it off the burner, and he poured it over a tea bag in a cup. And as Otoya began to stir his tea, he began to go over what he was going to do later that day. It was undeniable that Otoya had a very difficult afternoon in store. He had a meeting with a person who was very important, and during this meeting, Otoya would have to deliver some very bad news. In fact, this news was so bad that Otoya had decided what he was going to do was literally write down this bad news and hand deliver it. Now, Otoya had not quite figured out what he was going to write, but he knew whatever it would have to be perfect. For months now, Otoya had been trying to articulate this bad news that was really weighing heavily on him to his peers and to adults and to anybody who would listen, but nobody took Otoya seriously. Adults would look at Otoya and think, oh, that's just some kid. What he's talking about can't be serious. And when Otoya would talk to classmates, they would just kind of laugh at him. Otoya frowned and he looked out the window and he thought to himself, maybe this whole time I've been coming off as too angry when I talk about this bad news. Maybe I need to change the way I talk about it to sound more sincere. And as Otoya was thinking about this, he suddenly thought, oh my goodness, I know exactly what to write. And so Otoya abandoned his tea and ran over to his brother's desk. He grabbed a piece of paper and a pen, and he started writing. Over the last year, Otoya had felt like he had really grown up and really started to find his true self. He had been raised in a very strict household. His father was a colonel in the Japanese military, and he expected Otoya to be obedient and polite, and so that was what Otoya had done. But a couple of years earlier, Otoya had managed to secure a spot in a high school in Tokyo, far from where he had grown up, far from his father, and Otoya was really excited. He felt like going to this high school in Tokyo would finally allow him to kind of get out from under his dad's strict authoritarian rule. And his father had let him go to the high school in Tokyo, but after only a couple of weeks, it turned out Otoya's father had decided, nope, I don't want you to go there, and he had insisted that Otoya come back home and go to a Catholic school closer to their hometown. And it was at this point that Otoya, for the first time really in his whole life, he decided to push back against his dad. And so even though Otoya did come home, he did go to this Catholic school, as soon as he was home, he began constantly begging his dad to let him return to Tokyo, let him go back and live with his brother who lived in Tokyo, and let him go to the high school that he loved. And eventually, surprisingly, Otoya's father relented and said, okay, fine, you can go to Tokyo, you can do what you want. And so Otoya had been totally overjoyed. He had returned to Tokyo, gotten re-enrolled in the high school. But after only a couple of months, Otoya had kind of lost interest in the school, and instead his focus had now shifted to politics. Otoya's brother, who Otoya lived with in Tokyo, was very into politics, and he was always taking Otoya to speeches and rallies, and very quickly, Otoya had gotten into it. And eventually, Otoya began to think that his purpose in life was in politics, and he just didn't like the idea of having to wait until he graduated from high school to pursue that career ambition. But when Otoya brought these ambitions up to anyone who would listen, no one took him seriously. They looked at him as a skinny, scrawny, kind of meek little guy who was not going to make a difference in the world. But Otoya begged to differ. By now, Otoya was almost done with this note he was writing, And so he looked up and he checked the clock. He saw it was 2 p.m., which meant he really needed to get going soon. He was going to go to a political debate at the Hibiya Public Hall in downtown Tokyo, and the very important person he was going to meet and deliver this bad news to was going to be at this debate. Otoya took one more look down at the note he had just written, and he read it over a couple of times, and he realized he was missing one more line at the bottom. And so he leaned down and he wrote, quote, "I can't forgive you." Feeling like he was done, he folded up the note, put it in his pocket. He stood up, he grabbed his school uniform jacket and put it on. And then he grabbed this package that he had got from his father's house and he put it under his arm. And then he headed out the front door. Otoya always loved the walk downtown. The hall where this debate was going to take place was near the Imperial Palace, and it was this big, imposing building with a terracotta and stone facade that always inspired Otoya every time he saw it. When Otoya arrived at the hall, he saw loads of people streaming in through the front doors for this debate, and so Otoya joined them and made his way inside, and he moved towards the back of the auditorium, and then he began scanning the audience. And he saw there was at least 2,000 people inside, happily chatting and laughing and waiting for this thing to start. But all Otoya could think about was where this person was that he was going to be meeting, because as he was looking around, he didn't see them. At around 2:45 p.m., the moderator of this debate walked up onto the stage down in front. He went to the podium, he grabbed the mic, and he began telling the audience to take their seats and to be quiet, and then he began to explain the rules for this debate. Otoya at this point was really only half listening because he was still looking all around the inside of this hall for this person he was going to meet. Where are they? They're not here. 15 minutes later, at around 3 p.m., the moderator left the podium and a new speaker came out on stage. He was a politician named Inajiro Asanuma, and he was the chairman of the Japan Socialist Party. But when he began to speak and all the thousands of people in attendance leaned in to listen, Otoya was totally not listening because he could now see the person he was going to meet had arrived. Careful not to cause a disturbance, Otoya moved from the back of the auditorium over to the side of the building, and he began walking up a side aisle, only stopping briefly near a trash can where he pulled out that package he had brought from his father's house, and he unwrapped it and he threw the wrapping away and held on to what was inside of the package. And then Otoya looked down at what he was holding, he took a deep breath, and then he looked up and broke into a run. What happened next was broadcast live on television all across Japan. And by that evening, the footage had gone so viral that it was basically all over the world. A photographer who happened to be in the crowd of people watching this debate also happened to take a very iconic photo of what happened next involving Otoya, and that photo would actually go on to win the Pulitzer Prize in 1961. The Pulitzer Prize is a really big deal. It's the most prestigious award for journalism. It would turn out the very important person that Otoya was supposed to meet inside of this hall during this debate was in fact the speaker on stage at 3 p.m., Inajiro Asanuma, the chairman of the Japan Socialist Party. And the package that Otoya had brought from his father's house to this meeting was a samurai sword. And so after Otoya unwrapped the sword, he took a deep breath and then ran up on stage, charged to the podium, pulled back the sword, and plunged it into Asanuma's torso before he could do anything. And the photographer out in the crowd who would win the Pulitzer happened to snap a photo right as Otoya was pulling the sword out of Asanuma and getting ready to stab him again. Onlookers would immediately rush the stage and tackle Otoya, but the damage was already done. Asanuma would pass away from his injuries within the hour. It would turn out Otoya, ever since moving to Tokyo, had become a radical right-wing ultranationalist. The note that Otoya had carefully penned and then folded up and put in his pocket before carrying out this assassination basically just said that Otoya did not hate Asanuma personally, but Asanuma was slowly transforming Japan into a communist country, and so Otoya could not forgive him for that. And so Otoya decided he needed to act. Otoya was immediately arrested, but 2 weeks later, while he was in prison, he would take his own life.
Through the darkest night we walked. Light was out, but we just talked. Found our way with shadows near. Now the path is crystal clear. Life was tough, but we made do. Grown from pain that we once knew. Walls we built now fall away. Sky ahead is bright and gray. Future's glowing, can you see? Life ahead for you and me. Hard times past, we've paid our dues. Time to chase away the blues. Dreams were shattered on the ground. Picked them up without a sound. Glued the pieces, held on tight. Morning sun that brings a light. Every step has led us here. Through the worries, through the fear. Now we're standing in the light. Hands are held, the future's bright. Future's
As promised, here is a clip from last week's episode of our amazing podcast, Run Fool, hosted by the incredible, iconic storyteller, Rodney Barnes. Enjoy.
That's when Uma flew in for some damage control. Her tone was polite but firm as she informed the outsider that this was a private party. He needed to leave. Ethan flinched. This was so embarrassing. Was he going to get kicked out next? But the outsider didn't seem bothered. He asked again where Dr. Smith was.
Where is he?
Uma grabbed his elbow and pulled him towards the exit. That's when the man lost it. He ripped his arm from Uma and backed away, trembling. His mouth quivered. His eyes leaked fear. He opened his mouth and screamed. The wail cut through Ethan's head like a knife. He yelped and covered his ears with his palms. The other guests did too. So did Uma. But she looked wrong. Her head shook back and forth. It picked up speed until her features became a blur. Ethan could hear her choking too. Loud, hacking gasp as her throat struggled to keep up with the unnatural movement. Her trembling hands moved to her cheeks, a futile attempt to stop whatever was happening. Then, a loud crack echoed through the room. And with that, Uma's head twisted all the way around on her neck.
So that's going to do it. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious content, be sure you check out all of our podcast offerings out of Ballen Studios. If you look up Ballen Studios on any podcast platform, you'll find the MrBallen podcast, MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Run Fool, Bedtime Stories, and there's more coming. So if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, be sure to look up Ballen Studios and check out all those podcasts on whichever podcast platform you prefer. Thank you so much. Until next time, see ya.